June 21st, 1941. The border between the German Reich and the Soviet Union is unnervingly quiet. On one side, Soviet soldiers sleep in their barracks, dreaming of a peace bought by a signature on a piece of paper. On the other, 3 million men wait in the dark. They are checking their watches. They are loading magazines. They are standing beside the most powerful war machine the world has ever seen. Joseph Stalin is convinced that Adolf Hitler will not strike. He believes the pact they signed will hold. But as the clock ticks toward dawn, the greatest betrayal in human history is about to be unleashed. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa, the moment Hitler reached for the throat of the Soviet Union, and in doing so, lit the fuse for his own destruction.
The death warrant for millions was actually written months earlier in the opulent halls of Berlin. In November 1940, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov arrived in the German capital. On the surface, it was a diplomatic visit. They drank wine, they toasted to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But the air was freezing. Molotov was there to demand that Germany hold up its end of the bargain. Russia had sent the oil, they had sent the grain, they had sent the raw materials. But Germany was stalling on the machinery and weapons they had promised in return. Molotov left Berlin on November 14th, feeling the weight of a growing hostility. He didn't know it yet, but Hitler had already stopped looking at him as an ally. To Hitler, the Russians were no longer partners. They were obstacles. The camaraderie of 1939 was a corpse. The drums of war were already beating in the basement of the Chancellery. Hitler was finished with diplomacy. He was ready for blood.
To the world, Hitler spoke of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. But beneath the strategic justifications lay a deep, poisonous hatred. Hitler didn't just want land. He wanted to annihilate Stalin. He wanted to wipe communism off the face of the earth. His victories in the West had turned his confidence into a dangerous delusion. He looked at the Red Army and saw a colossus with feet of clay.
He pointed to the Winter War in Finland, where the tiny Finnish army had embarrassed the Soviet giants. He saw a Soviet military paralyzed by purges and led by a peacetime mentality. He saw aircraft parked in neat, easy-to-hit clusters. He saw artillery with no ammunition. He believed that if he just kicked in the door, the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. It was the greatest underestimation in military history. Hitler wasn't just preparing for a war, he was preparing for a walkover.
How do you hide 3 million men? You tell a lie so big that no one can believe it's false. As massive amounts of German armor and infantry moved toward the Soviet border, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine went into overdrive. They told the world that the troops were being moved out of range of British bombers. They whispered rumors of a high-level meeting between Hitler and Stalin. They told low-ranking officers to talk about a secret invasion of Britain.
The Luftwaffe even flew reconnaissance missions over the English coast to sell the ruse. Stalin, ever the paranoiac, found himself wanting to believe the lies. He ignored his own intelligence reports. He ignored the warnings from the West. He convinced himself that Hitler wouldn't risk a two-front war. While Stalin looked toward London, Hitler was staring directly at Moscow. The deception was perfect. The trap was set.
This was not to be a gentleman's war. Before the first shot was fired, Hitler issued 3 chilling orders that stripped away the last vestiges of military honor. He told his commanders that the Russians would not respect the rules of engagement, so they shouldn't either. He issued the Commissar Order. Every Soviet political officer was to be shot on sight. No trial, no mercy.
Finally, he decreed that no Russian prisoners would be brought into German territory. He feared the communist infection would spread to his people. This was a war of extermination, an ideological crusade to cleanse the East. The German soldier was no longer just a combatant. He was an executioner. The stage was set for a level of brutality that would shock even the most hardened veterans of the Great War. While the border grew heavy with steel, life in the Reich felt like a golden age. The German government had fixed the exchange rate to make the Reichsmark king in conquered lands. Soldiers in the West were sending home silk stockings from Paris and bottles of Chanel No. 5. The spoils of war were flowing back into German homes. War felt profitable. It felt easy. Hitler used this luxury to mold public opinion. He promised the people that a victory in Russia would bring even more wealth, more grain, more oil, more slaves. The German people followed him, not just out of fear, but out of greed. They believed the propaganda. They believed the Soviet Union would fall in weeks. They didn't see the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. They only saw the silk and the perfume.
June 22nd, 1941. The silence ends. At 03:30, the sky over the border erupts. 3,000 German guns open fire at once. It is a wall of sound that can be heard for miles. At 0:45, the steel wave crosses the frontier. This was the most massive invasion in the history of warfare. 2.6 million German men, supported by thousands of tanks and planes, surged forward.
The betrayal was total. Soviet units, stunned and confused, broadcasted frantic messages. "We are being fired on. What shall we do?" The reply from Moscow was often a terrified silence. The Red Air Force was decimated before it could even leave the ground. Thousands of planes were turned into burning wreckage on their own runways. Surprise was achieved. The door had been kicked in.
The map of the Soviet Union began to bleed. Army Group North raced toward Leningrad. Army Group Center tore through Belarus toward Moscow. Army Group South hammered into the grain-rich fields of Ukraine. It wasn't just Germans. Romanians, Finns, Italians, and Hungarians joined the crusade. Some were fierce. Others, like the Italian auxiliaries, were mocked by the Germans as a sorry sight.
Everywhere, the Soviet defenses crumbled. Communications were cut. Commanders disappeared. The Red Army was being swallowed in massive pockets of encirclement. Tens of thousands of men were captured in a single day. In the south, Romanian troops liberated Bessarabia, while the Soviets burned everything they couldn't carry in a desperate scorched earth retreat. To the leaders in Berlin, the war looked won. They were measuring progress in miles per hour. They thought they had broken the giant. By the end of the first 3 months, the German victory looked absolute. Great cities had fallen.
The Soviet Air Force was a memory. Millions of prisoners were being herded into camps. Hitler was at the peak of his power. He believed he had cheated destiny. But beneath the surface of the maps, the seeds of destruction were already sprouting. The Soviet Union was too big to be swallowed whole. For every mile the Germans advanced, their supply lines grew thinner. For every Soviet soldier killed, 2 more seemed to rise from the earth. And the Russian winter, the one thing Hitler's planners had ignored, was waiting. Hitler had achieved the greatest tactical victory in history, but he had committed the ultimate strategic sin. He had invaded the heart of a continent with no plan for what happened if the enemy didn't surrender. As the German tanks pushed deeper into the endless plains, they weren't driving toward victory. They were driving into a trap that would eventually consume the Third Reich. Hitler had bet his empire on a single throw of the dice, and the dice were still rolling.